I remember going to Rome in my first year to EUR, and we had an amazing talk by David Bass, who writes a bit, used to write on film, etc. And he'd shown us all of these, the films of like Les Clis, or various kind of shorter Fellini films. And then we arrived there and I was like, this feels really familiar. So, and that sort of initiated a real interest in the city, because it struck me as having the kind of the scale of the spaces, the level of the planning, and actually a lot of DC, the buildings that we think of as being core to the mall are relatively recent. I mean, some of those are as late as the 50s. And so it comes out of kind of 20th century planning, despite it being, an 18th century idea. And so, yeah, I did my third year dissertation on it with Peter Carl, which was a fantastic experience. I think I'd also recently read Mike Davis's City of Quartz, and somehow we both thought I could do a sort of City of Quartz as a third year undergraduate, but on Washington. And then I came back to it for my PhD and thought it would be a really nice opportunity to see where the collision of a sort of 18th century idea of landscape and a new republic coincided with modernity when it came through its kind of rehashing in the early 20th century through the City Beautiful movement. And then it got sort of squished. And, I started with the 18th century and I stayed in the 18th century, because actually this is a moment that's coming out of, it's a French, not even an architect. I mean, he was, Pierre L'Enfant was, he designed a number of forts. He was a kind of an army engineer, but he trained in landscape painting. And at the Beaux-Arts, and conceiving of an idea of a whole new nation at a moment when you're planning in what was then considered sort of wilderness. So the idea of somewhere between the kind of the tightness of the kind of French garden tradition, branching out into this incredible vast landscape.
It's interesting that you put it in relation to Rome, which actually couldn't be, I mean, you say it was familiar, but I mean, I guess it couldn't be more different, all the sort of historic layers. And
well, Eur in specifically, so the kind of the Mussolini Expo city, so the kind of Expo 42, where you have L'Éclisse or L'Éclisse, the Antonioni film was set partially there with Monica Vitti and Alain Delon. And that's like the whole film is about really this disjointed relationship, or the incapacity for these two to really come together. And this kind of epic kind of final scene where they're meant to meet at the zebra crossing and neither of them turn up. And it's sort of, I can't remember how long the take is, but it just goes on forever. The wind in the trees, the bus coming, leaving, nobody arriving. So it's kind of allegory, I suppose. And then you have this, is it The Cabinet of Dr. Antonio? It's like a very minor film by Fellini where this guy is dreaming of, there's a billboard outside his bedroom. I'm not remembering this very well. And I can't remember the actress, but like gorgeous kind of glam actress. And she's advertising milk. And then in his fantasy, she comes off the billboard and she walks through the streets of Eur. But she's like the height of the buildings, and they built the whole city in Cinecittà. So it's this incredibly constructed, abstracted kind of fascist neoclassicism, with its distorted kind of remaking of St. Peter's, and it's the Square Colosseum, which is in sort of every car advert, but the extended distances, the motorway running through it, this kind of completely constructed exposition. And then if you think DC, early 20th century DC came out of this idea of the city beautiful as it was conceived by those who'd been involved in the world's Columbian Exposition in Chicago. Mm-hmm. So which had this very, very different kind of take, but they're playing with shapes in a landscape. And actually the 1901 plans for that, they show these objects in this kind of parks program, because the mall was conceived of as part of a parks plan rather than an urban plan. I mean, they're not mutually exclusive, but they draw the rest of the city just as trees in some of the images, as if the city doesn't exist. It's a sort of denial of urbanity, which I thought was really interesting. But yeah, so I thought, strangely, I thought the kind of Italian fascism and American 20th century exuberance had a lot in common.
No, but I think when you take us to Fellini, I think that's where I can see DC actually, because my first thought was, Santa Maria degli Angeli or, Roman Forum. But actually in Fellini, we see the city being built and we see those peripheries of Rome and we see those construction sites. And that's actually is the right place to go to think of modernist urban planning, I guess.
Well, you think of, Ayora is really interesting because, in a way, it's a recreation of Rome in abstract. It's the city that is also bringing Rome back to the sea. And then, as is the case so often in Rome, the evocation or the re-evocation of these kind of classical tropes is a way of obviously, linking oneself back to a history of empire. And the fact that even in the 20th century, a place like DC adopts this kind of stripped, kind of inflated, slightly butch neoclassicist form is a way of describing a level of authority that there's not a lot of modernism in Washington. There's a few good examples, but they're few and far between. So you have the Hirshhorn, you have the East Wing of the National Gallery. In more contemporary terms, you do have new work, but until into the 1950s, the big museums were modeled on the British Museum or various examples, temples essentially, and European models of reinterpretations of classicism. So.
I really enjoyed when I spoke to you that one evening about Rome and the fact that I took my students to Rome and we had only one day. And I told you we arrived to Termini from Naples, and where do you go first? And I told you where I took them first, but I wonder where would you take us first if we find ourselves right there?
Oh my goodness. My goodness, that's a really tricky question. Because as you know, I had the luxury of spending, I think, 9 years taking students to Rome for a week. And so
it's a bit like a wallpaper guide.
Yeah. I've always loved the Campo de Fiori because it is both part of, it spans so many eras. It's still a living marketplace. You get the glimpses of the backs of kind of, the kind of antiquity that have been re-inhabited. It's the kind of the really classic moment where, you still have, the restaurant in the caves of the old, the back of a kind of a forum, and I can't remember whose, but you have the kind of the reuse that's still functioning, and then off of that you have Palazzo Farnese, but you get all sorts of different kind of moments that are embedded within that little corner. But there's so much. From I think we also took students to Pineta, like just behind where I think Acatone is set, the Pasolini film. So I think that there's that was amazing that those had cafes that were, there was a guy who his day job was as a kind of as a gladiator at the Colosseum. He ran a kind of a bar that had completely illegal electricity. It kept on going down. So that was almost like the sort of the world of Pasolini was still alive in this pocket really in central Rome. But yeah, I think the Campo de Fiori is a really good place to start. But I think, there's no one place because the city's always learning from itself. And I think, now feels a bit uncomfortable citing Rome as the kind of the one place to go to with students in a first year, because, you're sort of taking them on some sort of pseudo grand tour with everything that's associated with it. But having said that, there's certain ways in which you see centuries of architects responding to one another across those centuries and referring to one another in this incredibly natural way. where, you know, our references are so varied, but there the idea that people are just walking down the street and picking up a layered and entangled history that then gets redescribed through an architecture is so alive. I mean, even starting from the topography of the forum, which is orientated towards the kind of ritual practice, which, you know, you can get in, you know, Rickford, you know, but through to the way in which that kind of structures an understanding of public space in a lot of kind of Western architecture is coming out of a very particular relationship between hills. I mean, it's so, there's something so epic about it, and that, you know, something as simple as a geography and a geology shape ritual practice that then shapes everyday public life, even now, is a kind of an amazing idea. So maybe the forum would also, I mean, it seems pretty obvious, but once you get embedded and think of the forum as a place that was built and inhabited rather than simply an orchestrated sequence of temple structures and senates and etc.
There's something about it almost never really being able to be fully excavated. The city is really so entangled into it. Obviously, in the first instance, my inclination was to sort of go to look at ancient objects as well as, let's say, Renaissance insertions. And I mean, you did mention Baroque, I remember.
Oh yeah, and in fact, there's very little. I mean, in terms of urban planning, there's Renaissance, sure, but there's not much in terms of the architecture, which, you know, is then dominated by places like Florence. And, you know, there's kind of the resurgence with the Counter-Reformation, the Baroque is just so extraordinary. You know, I was, you know, when I was growing up, I thought it was completely over the top, and then I was reintroduced to it. And, you know, the way in which by then a kind of complex understanding of religion and cosmology became interwoven with a new scientific discovery, you know. Heliocentric universe, elliptical orbits, all of these ideas then get embedded in an architecture. And when you get something that's both tangible and intangible captured in a sort of a four-dimensional space, is, you know, you look at, say, you know, San Carlo alla Quattrofontane, the Borromini church, and you think, you know, this is not only something that defies the imagination, just in terms of mass curvilinear structures, produced in stone by human hands for a start, but the imagination even that could conjure that within an incredibly confined site, and the way in which a language, an architectural language, an ornamental language has become so complex and sophisticated, it can keep referring to itself at a range of scales is. And once you start to unpick it, or you try and draw it even, either diagrammatically or perspectively, you start to unpick just one layer after the next, again, of things that are referring back to stuff that's just down the road, you know, through to all the kind of Bernini work, which is, you know, I suppose bringing stone literally alive like a painter would. I mean, it's the level of sophistication is just amazing, but it's also coming out of a need to. I remember it being described to me that if the Reformation was developing a direct relationship with the divine, in that, you know, you could read the Bible in translation and you could have a direct relationship with God, the Catholic Church was responding by saying, like, you think you got this, well, we're going to give you paradise here on earth. And it's like, you know, there's very little common equivalent. I mean, it may be in the range of the way in which we might look at kind of certain virtual realities to be able to conjure something that's almost unimaginable. But the impact of that through an architecture that is still there within an urban environment, I find really powerful.
It takes us back to film, because it is quite profoundly cinematic and dramatic.
Well, it has a time frame. And I think, you know, it has a time frame. You know, I'm not religious myself, but I think that the way in which within traditional cultures, the ritual every day has a reflection in something that's understood to be cosmic. And that the time frame of just making it through the cycle of the week, the season, the year, has a relationship to the planets and the order of time. And that is then expressed through the vertical layering and the sequential layering of something like a church, particularly in like the Baroque period. It's like reading a really complex text. And kind of we're sort of not called upon to do that so much. Perhaps actually more in a virtual realm than we are in a physical, in that there is the need through film and through some forms of kind of virtual architectures to try and marry the tangible and the intangible, the everyday and a much broader order of time, or of kind of political order or social order. It's an interesting model.
Maybe it's actually a good place to also take a different perspective on how we can or should approach these cornerstones of Western canon with a new perspective, which we're in a way trying to develop. So how do we do that? How do we do that?
It's an almost impossible
to ask, Ingrid. Who else to ask?
I don't know. I mean, it's a really tricky one because, in fact, I just sat down, with a group of people here to talk about, what do you teach in first year? And there's this question of how do you question the canon? And then you have to say, well, what is the canon? And whose canon is it? And where does it start? And then what is it that one should be aware of? And one of the people I was talking to said, there's this thing called the Renaissance. You should probably know about it. But how much further do you go than that? So I think that, there's tremendous work being done. There's people like Ed Dennison and Marie Fraser who've done a tremendous amount of work by, updating or internationalizing, that kind of, the staple, the kind of the Banneker of architectural history by bringing in, sub-Saharan Africa, by bringing in China, by bringing in, continents and regions of the world that have been neglected in what we understand to be a history of architecture, that have well-established architectures that have been live and important for centuries, if not millennia. There's always also the problem of, when one is working within a context and providing an education, there are those cornerstones that you feel that people should be aware of. I think for me, and one of the ways in which we're restructuring the first year program is to, rather than to just try and teach those cornerstones, start to talk about, what we mean by history, what we mean by space, what we mean by when we talk about landscape. So how do these structures of knowledge, how do we introduce students to a structure of knowledge and a way of thinking, and then provide a series of potential cornerstones for them to undertake research into, and to make sure that those cornerstones bridge periods, bridge the globe, and bridge kind of modes of thought, so that there's an opportunity to investigate those further and to bring things together either in juxtaposition or into correlation. But it remains a really incredible challenge because the influences on the world around us are so varied, and also within a contemporary framework, highly personalized. So I think, the past however many decades, we've been working within a very nuanced and personalized understanding of the way in which we should regard an architecture or regard an architectural history. I think more recently, what's interested me is that there kind of aren't real absolutes. One of the areas that I find particularly interesting is, and worked with a number of students on, the effect of kind of diasporic movements, both within places like the UK or in Western Europe, and the other way around, the influence of kind of colonial control, not just in terms of political structures, but in terms of kind of cultural experience in particular places like Francophone Africa, where, you have people like Senghor, who were a professor at the Sorbonne at a time when Paris and France were still, essentially had human zoos in expositions. So there's this kind of peculiar contrast of different borrowed cultures becoming embedded within others. Which
is in a way what Rome did, right? It was a combination of Etruscan and Greek influences that came from somewhere else and materialized in that place.
Yeah, but I suppose also when you think of Rome doesn't Rome starts somewhere, but it kind of never ends. You're not just being the eternal city and all that. But I think that, we're also looking at, what is Rome when it's in parts of Africa? What is Rome when it's in Spain? What is Rome when in fact it's in the UK? And it's not the same Rome. And also it's not without its impact. And I think that if we were to look at, when we look at, say, the British Empire abroad, those legacies are really tainted, and they have important and very negative impacts on social structures internationally, obviously to this day, as we have, the barge now moored in Dorset, that is, essentially corralling groups of people that are largely from former colonies of the UK. I mean, it's dramatic in its tragedy, and its long historic tragedy. But there's sort of all sorts of things where you would think of the influence of Rome. People are sort of super excited about Roman roads when they find them in the UK. Roman road, but no one's necessarily talking about what was it to build a straight thoroughfare in a country or in a region like the UK, which was actually quite isolated, actually had kind of a level of localism that we would now celebrate in another country, but yet we're still celebrating kind of Romanness. So, this goes back also to relationships between perceptions of advanced technologies within places where they're unfamiliar. And it's perhaps a bigger issue, but I think this kind of question of the canon is an unsolvable question, because one would have to, it's that there's a story about, maybe it is Borges, about the story of the person who tries to draw the map of the world at 1-to-1. But there's a story by someone, let's call him Borges, about a man who sets out to draw a map of the world. But of course, there's so much detail, he has to draw it at 1-to-1, which is obviously impossible. The canon is a little bit like this. But I think that there's, and then there's a question of, and there's a bigger question on why do we study history of architecture, or really anything else? And I think that, particularly from the perspective of a place like the AA, which came up at a moment of, its heyday, it was probably, at the height of postmodernity, where, plurality, divergence of approach, opinion, that level of radicalism, the level of opposition to one another, really characterize the level of enthusiasm and debate. And you look back at that and you think, well, that level of discourse, that level of debate is different now. We've moved from the collision and opposition of ideas and the infinite possibilities of diversity of approach to a real yearning to come together with some sort of collective production. So, why are we asking these questions? To what extent are we looking for manifestations of different ways of thinking through an architecture? And then where do we find them? So if we're looking for, the radical complexity of trying to reconcile oneself with a kind of infinite, from a cosmological sense, then yeah, the Baroque is really useful. But so are examples of kind of astrological architecture in parts of India, which are extraordinary. There's all sorts of traditions that are seeking something that is that vast and that complex, which might have a lot of application now, because there are a lot of sort of existential crises on the horizon, be that AI, be that, the kind of impending large-scale conflict that seems to be brewing amongst large nations with nuclear power or nuclear armament. There's all sorts of things one could get panicky about that have huge implications. So maybe it is a time to start to think about, how does the practice of the everyday reflect something much, much bigger that is almost beyond comprehension? Is that the same thing as conflict, like the practice of recycling or not recycling, and its impact on, the kind of existential risk of climate crisis? So, maybe those complex architectures are really what we need to look at. And therefore, we're looking at the Baroque, we're looking at German Expressionism, we're looking at Zaha, we're looking at people who really embraced that level of complexity and saw the world as reflected in it. Or we're looking at those who, created, order be that the Romans, be that, I always think like Aldo Rossi, be that, those who found a typology within, or sought to sort of tidy up our understanding so it became more comprehensible. I think, then one can start to find that, I suppose, urge down through history, and to find those anchor points as a way of describing the way in which people have attempted that before. Nice conversation this morning about the kind of ritual practice of dining together and what that was as a form of collaboration. That in itself has a history, that in itself has anchor points. So I think that, it's really a question of what we're questioning.
Is it about what we're questioning or how we're questioning it?
Well, I think one comes before the other. I think for me, the question comes before the how. Because, yeah, that's quite an abstract question. And what kind of questions being asked? Because there's questions like, what do we do? And there's questions like, what does it mean? That are very different.
Audre Lorde famously said that we can't demolish the master's house by using the master's tools. So I just wonder whether in that there is something in terms of perhaps forms of engagement with discourse.
It depends on, I suppose it depends on the nature of the master's house. I mean, maybe my first question is, what is the house? And that's, you can ask that in a variety of different ways. But yeah, I think that, not to extend the metaphor too broadly, but what are we looking at? And then what tools do we need, or what tools are available? Because as much as, yes, we're demolishing the master's house with the master's tools, yeah, how do we make other tools available?
Okay, so I'll give you one tool that maybe you can reflect on. Drawing. What do we do with the drawing?
Well, I think this goes back to like, what question are we asking? Because I think that, drawing serves a number of purposes. I mean, drawing can be how to get from A to B. Drawing can be a set of instructions. Drawing can be a speculation that is coming from the imagination. Drawing can be a very, very close observation of a situation. But again, it comes back to, what are we asking it to do? To what extent is also a reflection of the person who's drawing? Because I think that there's certain things, the plan in the section, every year, I think, second and third year tutors, maybe fourth and fifth year tutors will say, they don't know how to draw a plan. It's like, well, plan is a cut through three-dimensional space that we draw for a very particular reason. And they're fascinating, as are sections, because they show a relationship between things that we can't necessarily see. But they're part of a very particular tradition and serve a very particular purpose. Archaeological drawings do something slightly different, but they measure something within space. But the idea of that kind of Cartesian way of measured, mode of measured drawing, there was a time before it that was also descriptive of relationships that weren't always spatial. So, even the plan in the section should be called into question as being an absolute. Fundamentally, I think, it was recently at the, the Herzog de Meuron exhibition, where, that whole hospital is, it's described in 3 dimensions all the time. It's there in BIM or Revit or whatever it may be. And that's a live drawing. That's a live 3-dimensional model that people are working on. They're not working on plans and sections. They're working on a virtual environment that is, one can add and examine at so many scales. Is that a drawing? Probably. And then it's serving a purpose that is about relaying incredibly complex information. But then, you know, a child can also draw from the imagination or by description or by copying. Yeah. And then within the context of, you know, being a student, I think that the drawing really needs to be part of a body of work. I mean, this, particularly since we've had so many means of accessing, you know, a global archive through, you know, it's when Pinterest was a thing, and then, you know, any other form of semi-social media or the internet or Zine or whatever it may be, provides you with so many incredible examples. And then one seeks to be incredible. But does that incredible really describe the thing that you're trying to communicate? It's a mode of communication, but it's like we've got to a point where everyone's is taking a sort of a piece of like James Joyce and trying to write like James Joyce rather than trying to explore what they're trying to say. And picking the most sophisticated and complex model for the way in which they would construct that drawing or that piece of prose, when really you should be questioning what you're trying to say. And it would create more original drawings.
You are in the business of education, of educating architects, and you have now looked from that angle. In a way, you've brought it back to the student. But maybe we could zoom out a little bit, and I could ask you, what do you think the purpose of education is, of architectural education? And surely there is different types of architectural education. One school will educate exceptionally good technical architects who will know how to make sure the U values are right. And in a way, the question doesn't necessarily relate to what kind of architect AA is educating, but it might be also about how and whether there is still scope for radicalism, for failure.
There's a lot of different questions. I mean, starting sort of from the back, this question of failure, I think, is a problem more generally in society. And I think that scrutiny is like nothing I've ever seen before. I mean, the capacity for failure 20, 30 years ago was quite big. Like one could fail and move on. And there was no evidence left behind, you know. It felt like the world was a little bit more forgiving. I think that young people are in a position where it's almost impossible to fail and move on. The pressure is enormous and unproductive. So radicalism is something slightly different because, you know, there's an assumption of the way in which we take risks, or the assumption that radicalism involves taking risks or doing things in an abnormal way. I think here we're pretty good at creating a safe enough environment for people to take those risks. I think that, you know, this has everything to do with not knowing where you're going. And I think even post-COVID in particular, students really like to know where they're going. You can't take risks if you know where you're headed, because there's just no opportunity for divergence. But then more broadly, you know, what the education of an architect is for is a bigger and more difficult problem. And I think that we tend to slightly belittle the technical in that it feels less sophisticated. Depends on where you are. So I think that I remember having a conversation with a student in another school, which was more technical abroad. And we're talking about sort of conceptual stages and exploring this and that, and how were ideas of history theory brought into studio work. And they said, you know, if I'd wanted to go to an art school, I would have gone to an art school, which made me laugh a lot. But having said
that, students said that.
Students said that, yeah.
In response to your comment.
Yeah. But you know, there's a broad task at hand, and I think that I don't know whether the film analogy or the food analogy is better, but you know, there's some incredible chefs out there that are radical, that are producing incredible food, some of which is beautiful to eat, some of which is beautiful to look at, some of which is just edible, some of which is produced for schools to enable students to have kind of basic and decent nutrition. I think that there's an enormous, but we all eat, and we should all eat a little better. This metaphor is not great, but I think that there tends to be, and this is also dependent on nationality, I think UK institutions, architectural schools, have a more conceptual bent than a lot of others, particularly on the continent. There's a little bit more of a technical focus in some countries on the continent in particular. I would say also the US has quite a strong kind of conceptual direction. But most of those people also have a kind of technical competence. They gain it over time. And as you know, like within a practical framework. So a lot of students here, and maybe I count myself in some peculiar way, are architects 10, 20 years down the line, but maybe they are making films, or they're making food, or they're raising children, but to me, they're still architects. Like, there's a way in which they structure their thought, or they structure the world around them, or they think through a set of issues that is very dependent on the way in which they're educated. But there's also a lot of people who engage in very conceptual thinking that also know where to put a damp-proof membrane, because it doesn't take that long to work it out. And they're very competent practitioners and doing some amazing projects. So I think that, the problem with the damp-proof membrane extends all the way through to ideas of safety and comfort and domesticity, or, the non-domestic. They extend to ideas of climate change. They extend to ideas of social and environmental responsibility. So it's a depth of knowledge. And what I love about a kind of architectural education is that its breadth has ample opportunity, or gives students an ample opportunity to find their feet in a part of that kind of cultural offering that suits what they can be in shaping the world around them. Because, if you Google architect, it's generally the architect of a plan it's often very rarely to do with buildings, but it's a person who can kind of piece things together in a very particular way. But also, the built environment is still there. Possibly there's more of it than we don't necessarily need to be building quite so much more. But we aren't necessarily just patching. We're not just necessarily just the diplomat. We're not, the person who's negotiating around a table. I think we're around to be able to think laterally, to look into the future, to look back into the past, to question the world around us in a way that very few modes of education do. So you get people who, in a more conventional kind of humanities degree, who have a really in-depth understanding of kind of literary theory, or of historiography, or different modes of thought, different modes of kind of constructing ideas. But they're not necessarily expected to produce them. I did a year of history when I was an undergraduate, and my last amazing supervision, this is an amazing person, and he said to me, because I said, I want to change to architecture, and he said, yeah, well, my wife and I, we often go to the cinema, and at the end we go to dinner, and we talk about the cinematography, and we talk about the direction. He said, but I don't want to make a film. I was like, but I want to make the film. And I think it's one of the few things where you are learning so much, and then you have an opportunity to put something out there that goes from the U value and the damp-proof membrane through to, what is a suitable representation of a form of culture? What is a civic space? What's its level of porosity to the kind of the public realm? I mean, these are huge questions. And I think that's what makes this form of education so challenging. And maybe it is redundant over time, because maybe there are particularly versions of AI that can just tell you where the damp-proof membrane goes, and that's all fine. But we're also the people that question whether we should be wet or dry. So maybe it's okay to experience more weather. Maybe that's a different way of living in the world. That level of speculation, I think, is something that we allow our students to do through a huge variety of means, from drawing, etc., onwards.
How did you yourself come to dedicating yourself to education of an architect? And I wonder whether there was ever a crisis of faith in architecture that maybe pointed at education as a more free form of thinking about it.
Well, yeah, but there's, education's a really privileged place to be, in that it's, yes, you can think about it. A lot of people in practice, work incredibly hard to produce some extraordinary projects at all different scales. It's a very, very labor intensive job. And not a lot of that, it's incredibly stressful. I think that the people who are in practice know this very, very well. It's still a very confrontational environment. There's huge amounts of people's often personal finances going through in a speculative way that is, it's not an easy job. It's a really, really tough job. I had the privilege of teaching from fairly early on, as many people do, sort of a day or two a week while I was working in practice. And, from having, the handful of jobs on site, seeing them through, fighting with contractors, fighting with legal teams, always having your guard up, to going in and having a conversation around, 20 odd projects that were like dreams. They're people fishing around for a way of describing something that they just can't put their finger on. I mean, it's like it's the best and most wonderful thing to do. And that's also just helping people articulate a set of ideas, which is at the root of what we do as architects. But it's like multiplied when you teach, because you get to do it with so many people over so many projects. But I think that, there's so many amazing projects, and they just take a tremendous amount of hard graft to bring into reality. And, it's like the people who are doing it, the patience, the energy, the dedication that they have to seeing that idea through to contribute something of delight to the world, not just something practical, but something that brings joy, that contributes something substantial to people's experience of everyday life, is like, it's a real labor of love. I mean, it's not easy.
I feel like I myself came to education at the point where I maybe had this mini crisis of faith in the profession. And I thought I'd go and try some other different things. And then I must say that through education, I rediscovered why I love the profession so much. I maybe rediscovered that conversation that wasn't being had in practice can still exist. And then also, I think maybe perhaps through education, you also encounter a lot more different forms of practicing, where that discourse is really part of the building process or that material process. So there is something about also forms of practicing that is potentially a really important avenue to explore and to teach students. And I wonder how do we do that?
That's a difficult question. I mean, there's so many ways of practicing, and I think, a lot of the people teaching here are good representations of that variety, from, small but collaborative practices to people who represent much larger, more established kind of commercial practices. They serve very different purposes. And I think, my ambition is that each person who teaches here is helping students understand that in some way. So if you have someone who is, embedded in a really substantial, famous, kind of more commercial practice, that students should learn what that means, what it means. Ethical questions like, do you take on roles in in countries whose human rights record you don't agree with? You know, what are the difficult questions that you are confronted with as a practice, as well as people who work within a kind of participatory practice framework, community action? You know, all of those things exist. And I think that the exposure the students have to them help them form different ways of practicing. Because I think the ways in which our students will practice might not exist yet. And there's good examples. I mean, I think that collaboration, cooperative structures are gaining a lot of ground, you know, particularly within this part of the world and Europe. But they're not the only way. And they realize things at very, very different scales. There will still be tall buildings, there will still be office buildings, there will still be large cultural buildings that need a certain size and structure to be able to just get the work out. Now, I hope that really strong designers are also doing that, but our inclination is to work much smaller, much more sensitively. That does leave all the insensitive things to people who aren't really thinking in that way. So I'm hoping that there's a bit of a broader brush there. I think overall, though, I think that I'm actually frustrated with the level of anxiety around the profession. I think everyone's doing a lot of very anxious navel gazing. And I think that there's a lot of work still to be done. I think perhaps rather than questioning the value of the profession, we just need to keep doing our best that we can in a dignified way. And to take our value a little bit more seriously without, you know, that doesn't have to be sort of, you know, what are we as a profession? We should be taken seriously. Just people need to value their contribution, to understand that we're not just pragmatic. We're not just giving answers and solving problems. You know, the really great projects that exist in the world are tremendous leaps of creative imagination. That has value. That's something extraordinary. That's a kind of a gift to the world. It's not just the hours you put in to make sure the U value is correct. That's like the bread and butter. So I think, you know, maybe I did have a crisis. I think that I didn't have a crisis really, because I had the benefit or the difficulty of, you know, going on maternity leave, which gave me a moment to think hard about what I wanted. The practice I was working with didn't want me teaching anymore once I came back from maternity leave, so I decided to not practice or set up on my own, which, you know, forced me into a position that I'm very grateful for, but was all tied up obviously in what nearly 20 years ago was a perhaps more gendered environment.
These last few questions revolved around this idea of crisis of faith. But actually, as educators, we are almost always at risk of trying to restore someone's faith in their own work or in the profession. Where would you send a student when they're having this maybe sense of crisis? What's that building where you would, or place or space where you would tell them to go and experience?
I don't think I have. That's a little bit like my favorite building. I don't think I have one. I think, to me, any part of the physical environment, if you're unaffected by the physical environment, then yeah, maybe architecture is not your thing. But I think, you know, all the conversations we've had over the months about film, you know, I think that one can look at the delight and the horror and the suspense a filmmaker will construct through a physical environment. You know, to me, that's architecture. But I think that the crisis in the profession, the crisis students may have, I think is a result of a very limited idea of what architects do. And I've said this over and over again. I'm an architect. I'm still registered. And I feel like I am practicing architecture. I'm not necessarily working on site. I'm not working with clients any longer, but I'm an architect. You know, other women who take maternity leave and end up curating exhibitions or whatever they may be, they're still architects to me. So I think that the profession is just much broader than we've chosen to define it. And so when there's crises in it, it's a crisis in what I see as largely a 1950s model of what it is to work in an office. I think if you broaden the definition, then, you know, a little bit like, yes, you know, they're like food. There are people doing Michelin style work out of a food truck. And then there's there's, you know, McDonald's. It's all food, you know? And I think that actually what we're looking at is we think food is only, I don't know, high-end hotel restaurants. Like it's such a limited understanding of what we do. So, you know, I think it's more about encouraging students to understand what they do and what they love as also architecture.
So it's not necessarily about the space or place or building, but it's more about pedagogy, or is it?
It's about, I mean, to me, all architectures, be they at the level of the table or at the level of the city or the landscape, are to do with the way in which we frame society, the way we frame culture, and we're active within that all of the time. And that goes beyond pedagogy. That's just the way we are in the world. Most of the time, we're trying to make sense of the world around us, and we happen to be doing it through architecture. But you know, the mission is pretty common overall. Unless you're not trying to make sense of it, and there's lots of people not trying to make sense of the world around them. Some people are just trying to make a living, and actually, architecture is a perfectly decent way of doing it. But more they can think about it as any number of ways, and I think that certainly the study of architecture gives you ample scope to do that. So you might as well carry on studying it and see where it takes you. And
when it comes to methodology with which we learn about architecture, we could split the question in two. One is about research being a sort of effectively the base of a project, and then the other one is about creativity being under perhaps something that is either overrated or underrated in the current climate.
I think it's massively underrated, to be honest. I mean, I think I actually get a little frustrated with the research issue, in that I think that it's maybe just termed it has the wrong term. I think that we should have some knowledge. I think that most students of architecture don't necessarily ever have enough knowledge, or they do research from first principles that doesn't benefit from hundreds of years of research of others who do this all the time. So I think most research supports projects. A lot of research is pretty thin, and sometimes it helps for people to, I mean, what I always did when I was still teaching, so I would get students to speculate creatively before they initiate research. Because if you were undertaking a thesis, you would, before you even started doing your research, you would develop an understanding of your method. You would structure research questions, and you would do a literature review. This is very boring, but it's actually quite a decent established way of structuring a body of work. Now, to me, the creative speculation, the what if, the drawing, the model, the instinctive response to, let's call it a 4-dimensional question, is like a really good research question. It shows the things that you're interested in. It demonstrates an area of focus that enables you then to look at how others have approached similar problems. So you very early on then belong to, you know, whether you're someone who is involved in direct action and participatory practice. You know, you're someone who actually is speculating from the level of a kind of satellite technology and the understanding of a kind of global view of the world. You know whether you're looking deeply into historical context and unpicking a very physical site forensically. These are all really, really different approaches. And you have to, you kind of want students to understand that they belong. There's other people that belong to that. There's other people who've done this before, be that, you know, as you like Francis Alice as a really good kind of reference point for someone who is acting in the world in this very immediate way. You know, but dragging a block of ice, you know, that didn't start with research, but it's powerful. It belongs to a way of working. At the other end of the spectrum, yes, you know, if you're working within a particular historical context, understanding kind of social conventions, understanding the way in which people live, conducting proper ethnographies, talking to people in a responsible way, that's one way of working. It's not the only way of working. And so I think that we have, really actually very traditional ways of undertaking research that are largely built on early 20th century ideas of social sciences, mapping, oral histories, with some variation. And it barely touches the surface of what one would really want to understand. Now, there are things that then take you off in a really particular direction. People might become obsessed with, the structures of the free market economy and its problems. That might become the basis for a project, but they would have to get there somehow. And I think most people just dive into research like it's this thing that they have to do, like taking medicine before they can have a creative idea. No matter what, good projects come out of an intuition. They come out of, a synthetic response rather than just an analytical response. I don't think good projects come out of more knowledge. In fact, sometimes, in having run a design research course, the more knowledge a student has, the weaker the project will be, because it closes down avenues of exploration.
And if you like doing Sudoku, when you're faced with an empty Sudoku, if you put every option on every square, you realize that the amount of information that you've given yourself is just, you just actually can't take this anywhere. You can never solve it because the amount of information is too much. So you need to really give yourself so little information to really understand patterns, to really, again, more intuitively begin to solve.
But then people are amazing. I remember I had a first year student who's, now grown and running practices and things. We had a project in Southwark and next to the railway arches. And it was like a youth hostel. It was like first year project. And I said to them, okay, look, they were really stuck. And I said, just do what you think is really obvious. And they said, I can't do what's obvious. I said, well, what's obvious? And they said, well, obviously you want to do just giant arches, like 100-story arches. I'm like, not obvious to anyone else, but that sounds amazing. Let's try it. And it was this kind of weird vertical structure where all the rooms are held in the legs of these arches and this kind of massive landscape on top. It was absolutely fantastic. Now, if he'd started with like a little site analysis and doing a little thing and a little exploration there, he would have ended up with just the same old project as everyone else. But that stab in the dark allowed this tremendous leap of imagination that was so, the individual creative spirit is an extraordinary thing,
I know.
Absolutely shouldn't be undermined.
I do have one question, and I think this maybe brings us all back to you. And this idea that you actually mentioned earlier in this conversation, that maybe we are at the point where we are converging into, I don't know whether it's a line of inquiry or a way of looking at the world or understanding the world. In what way do you think that convergence will manifest itself? Is it a movement that has some sort of shared aesthetic quality, or is it something else? And maybe the connection can be made with your amazing analysis of African modernism and how that used modernism in a completely different way. And so I just wonder whether those two things can be brought together. And
I think it would be interesting to step back and think, in 100 years, there's so many things that we do now that will be unforgivable. Whether that's a movement, whether that's a revolution that helps people wake up to that. I mean, I am all for kind of the creative expression through architecture. I think that there's a lot of dull, mediocre, badly constructed buildings out there, and we can do better. But the level of demolition, the level at which kind of consumerism and the basic disregard for the existing built fabric, and that's not about being precious, but about being bold with working with what we have. I think in 100 years, the rate at which we dispose of our built environment is going to be criminal. So I think that thinking really radically about how we deal with an existing world is something absolutely essential. I think that the kind of the leap of imagination that was happening in places like sub-Saharan Africa at the moments of independence was using architecture to describe an idea, very simply. And whether that was capital M modernism in the European sense, or whether that was able to evolve into something perhaps that was more local and less influenced by the former colonial masters, is open to a lot of debate. However, there was a level of enthusiasm where everything was possible. We're now in a situation where I feel like nothing is possible, which is hence the kind of the crisis of the profession. I think we have to snap out of it, because there's nothing more useless than feeling useless. So I think if it's going to be something collective, I think we have to be a little bit more willing to maybe be a bit more like Rome, to work radically with what we have, to sometimes disregard the preciousness of what we think is important, which is largely class-ridden. You know, the historicity of the built environment is deeply flawed. So, you know, there's a lot of disruptive thinking that really needs to happen, and people need to act with more confidence, with kindness, with thought, with a generosity of spirit, but with some confidence. I mean, this is why I'm so tired of the crisis of the profession. Like, maybe we should stop talking about ourselves and just get on and do what's needed, and to do that collectively, and not kind of puff out our chests and argue for our position all the time. This is actually not about us. It's about